Hey, welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So for today's video, I'm going to be doing a significant sized book on haul. I've recently been going through all of my belongings, my clothing, my bits and bobs, and really being not more brutal about my decisions about what I'm keeping versus not keeping, but I think I'm just being more honest with myself this time around, and it has really made a significant difference to my headspace. And basically this is part of my major clear out that I'm doing before Christmas. I like to do these every year. It just makes me feel better going into the new year, knowing that there's a lot less clutter. There's a lot less things in the house that are making me feel guilty that I'm not using or not utilizing. So let's get into this book on haul. I think all of these books I've read except for one, but I have a very good reason as to not wanting to read this one particular one that I think you'll be very understanding to. So I might as well start with the book that I haven't read, which is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I picked this up used in a charity shop about 2 or 3 years ago for €1 or €2, so I'm not that racked with guilt over letting it go. But basically it's a series that hasn't been finished, and it doesn't look like it's going to be finished from what I can tell. And I'm just not interested in getting invested in a world and characters only to be left disappointed. And I have enough book series on my shelves that I'm trying to work my way through that are finished, that I know I'm going to enjoy. So I just don't feel necessarily motivated to pick this up when I know that so many fans of the series have issues with the author, and I just don't really want to be part of that. The next book that I'm letting go is The Troop by Nick Cutter. So I read this a couple of years ago. It was really hyped up on Booktube by people who specifically weren't horror readers, and I think that's why so many people were impressed by it at the time. They thought it was the most hardcore, the most disturbing, most disgusting horror novel that they'd ever read. And then when I read it, I was like, wah wah. Like, it would just really miss the mark for me. Sure, it had interesting horror elements, it had decent body horror. Also, just a heads up, it had, I think it was 3 moments of animal abuse within it, so if that's something you want to avoid, then maybe avoid this. And also in recent months this book has become really popular because of Book Talk, and now it's so popular you can find it in most TK Maxx's in Dublin at the moment for $5.99. I also feel like I'm a seasoned enough horror reader that I know my tastes, and this just didn't live up to my expectations of what could have been a really great substantial horror novel. This just kind of left me wanting a little bit more. There is like a mixed media element to this book, which also I found really irritating when reading it, because it actually ends up spoiling one of the chapters before you get into it. Like, you know who's going to die, and I was just like, really? Like, you know, we don't even have the anticipation of like reading the moment of when it actually happens. I already know, just based on this pointless mixed media element that you have in here just for the sake of having it. Overall, I feel like it could have been done a little bit better, and I feel like it's certainly overhyped. No surprise to anyone, but I will also be letting go of Cows by Matthew Stokoe and The Summer I Died by Ryan C. Thomas. These were both featured in a reading vlog I did like 2 months ago, my extreme horror reading vlog. If you want to know my full thoughts on them, you can check out that vlog, but I did not enjoy either of them. I thought they were both fairly poorly written. I feel like they were both definitely overhyped, and the stories themselves were quite dull and not exciting enough for me to be like super entertained by them. The gory, kind of more brutal elements, especially in Cows, was there for sure, but aside from that, they just really fell short for what I was expecting them to be. Another book that I was super disappointed in, and to be fair, had I read the afterword first, it would have given me everything that I needed to know about this novel before going into it, and it would have let me know that this was not the novel to begin this author's like backlog of work with. But I'll also be letting go of You, Me and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. So basically in his afterword, he said that he just wanted to write about 2 characters that had kind of mundane everyday jobs. Like, there wasn't anything particularly special about them, but he wanted them to be like living in a fantasy like world, and that was kind of the overall goal. And I'd say he achieved that, but I was so bored while reading this novel, and I really had to force my way through it. I believe I read like half of it, and then I left it for probably about a month or 2 before finally finishing it, because I just had no motivation to pick it up. Because 1, I'm not really into kind of like low-key romance tales. 2, I really wasn't digging the fantasy elements within this. It felt a little bit repetitive. there wasn't really enough risk for me. It was very kind of like low stakes. And anytime there was a moment where it was going to build up to like an action sequence, it was just really underwhelming with how it played out. I say the most entertaining aspect of this book was the narrator's perspective. He was very sassy. He picked up the novel in moments when it desperately needed a little bit of comic relief. But aside from that, I feel like it was a really unmemorable story. For my first ever Brandon Sanderson novel, I was so unimpressed by it. So 2 books that I'm letting go for very superficial, shallow reasons is just because I want to let them go so that I can later upgrade them into superior editions. The first one being It by Stephen King, and then The Stand by Stephen King. So these are 2 of my all-time favourite Stephen King novels. I gave The Stand 4.5 stars, I gave It 5 stars, and I feel like they deserve to be upgraded into something spectacular. You know, I hate these covers. I've always hated these editions of Stephen King books. I especially hate the spines. They just look so mundane on the bookshelf, and they kind of remind me of like the bare basic editions of books that you'd have to get for college or secondary school. I'm not going to immediately rush out and replace them. This is something I'm going to do over time, but I'm happy enough to let these 2 go and let somebody else read them. 2 more favourites that I'd like to replace in the future is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis and The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. These are 2 of my all-time favourite books. They are in disgusting condition at this point because they're so old. I've had them since I was like 15 or 16. The spine, especially on this, is like really sun damaged. And I just feel like I'm at that point now, again, where I just like to have them in some really nice kind of long-lasting editions. I know a couple of months ago a really nice hardback edition featuring the original kind of cover art for The Wasp Factory came out, and I'd really like to get that one at some point. And I was thinking maybe even getting the kind of classic American version of American Psycho, because I've always really liked that. I feel like I always prefer American covers over UK covers, just because I feel like the American covers are more iconic because you tend to see them in like film and TV. But yeah, both of these books were printed on fairly acidic paper, and the insides of them are really speckled and just really kind of damaged over time. So that's something else that I need to really think of when it comes to my book collection, is like how I'm going to maintain it and kind of preserve it to make sure that my current books don't get as raggedy as these 2 ones. Next on the to-go pile is Piercing by Ryu Murakami. I got this secondhand again. A lot of these are actually secondhand, so I feel like that's aided me in not feeling super guilty of getting rid of certain books, but I was really disappointed by reading this. I feel like my favourite Ryu Murakami book was Audition, and that was the first book that I actually read from him, and that really kind of set the bar of like where my expectation fell, and this just didn't live up to the premise. I just thought it was a little bit underwhelming by the time I got to the end of it, so I was just hoping it would be more hardcore or more extreme than it ended up being. Another weird book that everyone absolutely adores, but I just didn't really get the hype of, is Bunny by Mona Awad. I really don't gel well with Mona Awad's writing style. I read Rouge by her this year as well, and that was just not for me. I feel like I definitely preferred Bunny to that, and I even featured Bunny in a reading vlog either last year or the year before, and I got through it really quickly. Like, I read it pretty much in one day, I think, from what I recall. And I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. There were certain elements to the writing style, such as like the weird dreamlike visions where you don't know what's real and what's not. And it's very hard to keep me on track when I'm reading something like that. It's very hard for me to keep my attention. I find that in those kind of moments, I tend to reread paragraphs over and over again to try to make head or tail of them. And I just wish I'd had that experience that so many other young women have had when reading this, you know, being able to kind of relate to it. In a weird way, I'm kind of like jealous of people who really were able to get into it, because it really is kind of like a cultural phenomenon within certain circles on the internet. In a kind of knee-jerk reaction to decluttering, I'm also going to be getting rid of the majority of my collection of Penguin English classics. I'm getting rid of all of them but one, because I haven't read one of them yet, and like I said, I really don't like getting rid of books that I haven't read, just because I know that I'm probably going to enjoy it for the most part, which is why I picked it up in the first place. But I hate these editions. I much prefer either the Penguin Classics Deluxe editions or the Penguin Black Classics or even the Penguin Modern Classics. And these will probably all be getting replaced into the Penguin Black Classics. I hate the font in these books. I hate the fact that there's no like further reading or anything like that. Like, I want my classics to have a feel of academia to them, to be an actual resource. So the first two from this collection that I'm letting go of is Tess at the D'Urbervilles and Far from the Madding Crowd, both by Thomas Hardy. These are two of my all-time favourite classics. Well, maybe not Tess at the D'Urbervilles, that it was really, really depressing and quite a hard read to get through, if I'm going to be honest. But Far from the Madding Crowd is fantastic if you haven't read it. Then there's Daisy Miller and The Turn of the Screw by Henry James and War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Both of these I want to upgrade. I wouldn't mind getting like a bind up of each of these authors' works, especially H.G. Wells, because so many of his novels are like novellas or just over the page count for a novella and stuff. It would be handier for me to just have a bind up where I can have just one source for all his stories. And the same goes for The Great God Pan by Arthur Mack. And The Great God Pan is one of my all-time favourite novellas ever. It is fantastic. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's a great time of year to read it. But I would love a bind up of all of Arthur Macken's works, and I'm trying to find an edition at the moment that would suit me, or at least that has the majority of his works in it. And then lastly in this collection is Passing by Nella Larsen. If you haven't read this is probably like one of the most gripping but most shocking novellas that I've ever read. By the end of it, I really had to pick up my jaw up off the floor because I couldn't believe how it ended. But it is a fantastic story if you haven't read it yet. And I think the last classic that I'm going to be letting go of in this Unhaul is The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. I hate this edition of this book. I love the story, but I hate this edition. The font is absolutely minuscule. It felt like it took forever for me to read just because the font was so small. And I just hate this cover. I don't even know who puts these out. It's Wordsworth. It's a Wordsworth edition. So that's why it sucks. I actually lied. I didn't realize I had another classic to let go of. And this one is a hard one because of the edition that it's in. But it is the Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories by H.P. Lovecraft in the spectacular Penguin Classics Deluxe edition. Now, I will treat myself to a Penguin Classics Deluxe edition maybe once a year around my birthday because they are quite pricey, and I usually will buy books that I've already read and I'm just upgrading it because, you know, I want it to be like my forever edition. So this was my first time round reading anything by H.P. Lovecraft, and obviously I respect the influence that he's had on other authors and on the horror genre, and I could see that within his writing. But some of the stories were incredibly difficult to read because of the amount of racist and prejudiced rhetoric within them. I was like, wow, H.P. Lovecraft really hates everyone. Even by the end, he was like, and another thing about the Irish. And you know, I'm not a person who would advocate for changing the works of a famous author just because the language that's used within it isn't the standards that we use today and is offensive by today's standards and all that sort of thing. But I feel like I would have had a much easier time with reading certain stories if that really wasn't at the forefront of my brain for the majority of it. Kind of feeling like a shit for reading it in the first place. And I know that shouldn't be my reading experience, but it did make me feel guilty that I was reading it in some way. Speaking of feeling like a shit for reading something, I'm also going to be letting go of Coraline by Neil Gaiman. So obviously, I'm a huge Neil Gaiman fan. I have several of his books on my shelves. I've loved his work ever since I was a teenager. I've always found his writing to be very comforting. And naturally, I was incredibly disappointed when the allegations about him came out earlier this year. But I always feel like when it comes to like a author or a musician or an actor or whoever, whenever they like fuck up in a really serious way, I feel like as people who have enjoyed their work, we always kind of take it really personally as if it reflects badly upon us. All I can say going forward is that I still love Neil Gaiman's work, but I probably won't be buying any of his books new. I'll only be buying them secondhand or getting them from the library if I do want to continue reading him. But getting back to the book, I just didn't really enjoy it that much. I feel like I was too old when I read it to thoroughly enjoy it. And I feel like the film is like a much better adaptation of the story. It's like one of those rare situations where that happens, and it seems like a lot of people feel that way about this. Another book that I feel like was really overhyped by particularly Book Talk, but weird girl lit people in general, is Hard Copy. I was really looking forward to reading this because it sounded so bizarre. It's about a woman who falls in love with her work printer, and she's forced by her boss to take some time off from work because everyone in the office just feels like she's having a nervous breakdown, and they can hear her talking to herself, but she's actually talking to her printer. And it just wasn't weird enough for me, unfortunately. It could have just gone so much further than it did. I will say that the printer was a distinguished gentleman. He is the type of printer that you'd want as a son-in-law. But aside from that, I feel like it was one of the weaker books that I've read so far this year. I was so disappointed because I didn't have the patience to wait to get it from the library, and I really should have. Another book that I'm letting go of is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I can't find any of his books in these editions. I've been looking for a couple of years now, so I think I'm just going to get either a bind up or just get them in like the Penguin Modern Classics editions or something, because it drives me mad that I just have this lonesome mass market paperback edition of this sitting on my shelf, and it's not part of a collection as it should be. Again, this is one of my favorite books ever, and I just feel like I'd really like to upgrade it, not anytime soon, but at some point in the future. The next book is one that I'm still sort of debating on in my mind as to whether I should let go or not. It is Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Aw. This is a novella about a mother and daughter, and it's basically about a trip that they take together and the daughter's continuous disappointment in her mother because her mother is not really acting in the way that she not ought to act, but the way the daughter wants her to react. She's just her own person, and it's more so about the daughter accepting her mother as her own person and as like, this is just the way she is and I can't change that. And it is a very sweet and endearing and relatable story, but I just don't feel like I'm ever going to read it again. And even though it is a novella, it's not like it takes up a huge amount of space on my bookshelf. I'm just kind of being, more brutal, more honest with myself and saying, like, is there any genuine point in me keeping this? And I feel like the answer is no. Then I'm going to be letting go of some manga. I don't want to say like I'm trying to grow up or whatever, but I feel like manga and graphic novels and stuff were a huge thing for me as a teenager and like in my early 20s. But now that I'm 31, I forgot how old I was there for a second. I was about to say 36. I feel it sometimes. Now that I'm older, I'm just not as invested as I was in reading and buying mostly manga series. There's just so many of them. There's so many volumes. Part of me feels like my brain is like, stop being childish with liking that sort of thing. Like, obviously, I'm not going to let go or stop collecting editions of like Junji Ito's work or whatever. But I feel like there's other things that I bought based solely on nostalgic reasons that I'm like, I have to cut that out because it's not necessarily the healthiest thing to be like diving back into my childhood just because I feel like I can't cope with adulthood. So in saying that, I'm going to be letting go of 3 volumes of Sailor Moon. So I've got the first, second and third Sailor Moon books here. I also had the 4th, but I don't know where it's gone. I think maybe it might have already made its way out of the house. This is a series that I loved as a small child. I used to always watch Sailor Moon on TV. I grew up in Spain, so I mostly watched a lot of dubbed manga for cartoons. When it comes to like the Spanish channels, you're watching a lot of Pokemon and Digimon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Sailor Moon and all these other animes that were really popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I do have a lot of nostalgia for the Sailor Moon franchise and stuff, but I don't feel like the mangas are great. I feel like they're great if you read them when you're like 12, but as a 31-year-old, I'm kind of like not motivated to collect the rest of the series. They also take up so much space on your shelves, and I just have to be an adult about it and tell myself no. The next manga series that I'm going to be letting go of is because it is genuinely awful and it is probably the worst manga I've ever read in my life. It is Innocent W. So I picked these up from a book fair like last year, I think it was. I picked them up because I was like, oh, it's got pentagrams on it, and I kind of flipped through it and I was like, it looks like it might be a horror manga. And it also is a complete run on this particular series, which was rare for this book fair. I read them earlier this year and it was god awful. It's a weird story about like witch hunters hunting down witches, and all these witches were on a journey on a bus, breaks down on the side of a mountain. But then you keep forgetting like where they are, because all this manga is like up close shots of characters' faces, or then panty shots. It's kind of like a battle royale situation. I wouldn't really recommend this, and I'm not holding on to it. For the exact same reason, I'm also going to be letting go of the first 2 volumes in Evil's Return. This is a series I also picked up on the same day from the same book fair. I believe that this is a 4-part series, so I only have the first 2 volumes. I feel like finding the next 2 is going to be a nightmare since it's out of print. And also it's a very, very kind of saucy looking series that seems to be quite low on the horror aspect and high on the sauce. So I just don't really have any interest in reading this or in trying to track down the other volumes. So that has been my last book on haul of 2024, and it's onwards and upwards into Christmas and the new year. I've made a decent amount of shelf space by getting rid of these. Let me know if you're having a clear out, if there's anything you want to get rid of, or if any of these books I'm making a mistake in getting rid of, which, I don't feel like I am, but sure, let me know anyway. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my Instagram and TikTok, where I make short form bookish content that I don't really make over here. And if you haven't done so already and you like these types of videos, feel free to like and subscribe, because it really helps the channel out and it gives me a good indication of what you like and what you don't like and what you want to see in the future. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.